The vote was unanimous. This is the fact that historians return to most often, because unanimity in the Concordance Council was extraordinarily rare. The Council had 31 member species, with 31 distinct political traditions, 31 sets of interests, 31 definitions of what the Council was for. It had been convened in genuine unanimity 3 times in its 300-year history, and each time the unanimity had been the result of a threat so unambiguous that the 31 species' positions converged despite their differences. The vote on Resolution 7 VAR, which came to be known simply as the Erasure Resolution, was the 4th such unanimity. The resolution had a formal title and formal legal language and 31 signatures. What it said, stripped of the diplomatic phrasing that formal resolutions required, was this: the human species represented a threat to the stability of the known systems of sufficient magnitude that its continued existence could not be permitted. The resolution passed on a Wednesday. I know this because I was in the observation gallery when it passed. I was 12 years old. I am not writing this from a position of retrospective certainty about how it ended. I am writing it because I was there for all of it, because my family was at the center of what happened next, and because the record requires a witness who was present. My name is Mara. This is what happened. To understand the vote, you need to understand what the Council had been watching for the previous 40 years. The human species had joined the Concordance in 2287, 11 years after first contact. Following the standard integration process that the Council applied to newly encountered sapient species. The integration process was a probationary period during which the new species was monitored, assessed for compatibility with Council norms, and gradually incorporated into the economic and diplomatic structures of the Concordance's network. Most species completed the integration process in 12 to 15 years without significant incident. Humanity completed it in 11 years, which was faster than any previous species, and the 11 years had included for significant incidents to minor diplomatic crises, one major technological development that the Council had not anticipated, and a pattern of behavior that the Council's assessment division had described. In Year 8, as exhibiting consistent unpredictability relative to established species, behavioral models. The phrase consistent unpredictability had been flagged in the Year 8 report as a contradiction in terms, and the author had explained that the phrase was intentional. Humanity's behavior was consistently, reliably unpredictable, not random, not erratic, specifically, systematically different from what the Council's models predicted, in ways that the models could not account for even after updating for the previous deviations. By Year 11, the Council's assessment division had a specific concern. The concern was not that humanity was hostile. The behavioral record showed that humanity was not hostile in any systematic sense. The concern was that humanity was developing. All species developed. Technology advanced. Political structures evolved. Cultural practices changed. This was normal and expected. What was not normal was the rate. Human technological development in the 11 years since integration had proceeded at a pace that the Council's assessment models had not predicted, and that, on extrapolation, produced a trajectory that was alarming not because of where humanity was, but because of where the trajectory pointed. The models showed that in 40 years, if the development rate continued, humanity's technological and industrial capacity would exceed the Concordance's collective capacity in 17 of the 23 categories the models tracked. The models had wide error bars. They might be wrong. The development rate might slow, but the error bars could not rule out the trajectory. And the trajectory, if it was hell, meant that in 40 years, the Concordance would be facing a species that had been integrated for 50 years, and that was more capable, by most measures, than the entire rest of the Concordance combined. The council spent 30 years debating what to do about this. The debate produced a specific kind of institutional exhaustion. The arguments had been made and refuted and made again. The uncertainty in the models had been analyzed from every direction. The policy options had been proposed, discussed, rejected, and proposed again. In year 41, a specific event resolved the debate. A human research team, working in a field that the Concordance's scientific community had considered theoretically closed for 200 years, produced a breakthrough that the Council's scientific advisors described as redefining the boundaries of what was possible in 3 adjacent research areas. The breakthrough was not a weapon. It was not developed for military purposes. It was a fundamental scientific result in energy physics that had civilian and commercial applications. But it was also, the military advisors noted, something that could be adapted. The Council's Military Analysis Committee spent 3 months assessing the implications. Their conclusion was that the adapted version of the research could, in the hands of a sufficiently resourced actor, produce a capability that the current Concordance defense architecture had no response to. The current Concordance defense architecture had been designed around the full collective capability of 31 species. The human species, alone, on the trajectory the models showed, would have the resources to develop the adapted version within 20 years. The Military Analysis Committee's report went to the full council. The full council deliberated for months. Then it voted, unanimously. My mother was in that room. Not as a council member. Humanity was not a council member. The integration process had been completed, but full membership, with a council seat and voting rights, was the next step, and the next step required a council vote, and the council had just voted for something else. My mother was there as the head of the Concordance Human Liaison Office, which was the administrative position that managed communication between the human species and the council. It was not a high-status position. It was a functional position. The kind of position that an institution created when it needed to manage a relationship that was ongoing, but that it had not quite decided what to do with. My mother had held it for 7 years. Her name was Dr. Elena Vesquezisei, and I have described her elsewhere in this record, and he will describe her here, as she was on that Wednesday, calm, not performing calm, not composed in the surface-level sense of features, arranged for observation, calm in the specific sense of someone who had known this was coming and had spent years preparing for it. She had known it was coming. Not the specific date, not the specific margin, not the exact legal language of the resolution. She had known for years that the resolution or something like it was possible. She had been monitoring the assessment division's reports, which were available to the liaison office as part of its administrative access. And she had watched the trajectory of the council's concern the way you watched a weather system you knew was heading toward you. She had spent for years preparing. What she had prepared was not a diplomatic argument. She had made diplomatic arguments for 4 years, through every available channel, and the diplomatic arguments had been heard and weighed and had not changed the trajectory. What she had prepared was something different. I was in the observation gallery because she had brought me. She had brought me because she believed I should see it. Not because she was certain about the outcome, because she believed that whatever happened, I should have been there. That the record in my memory of what the council chamber looked like on that specific Wednesday was something I would need. She was right. After the vote, the gallery cleared. The council members left. The administrative staff began the process of documenting the resolution. My mother sat in the gallery for 45 minutes. I sat next to her and did not speak, because I was 12 and I understood that this was a moment that did not require speech. Then she sighed okay. That was all she said. We left. The resolution specified a timeline. Humanity had 6 months to respond formally to the resolution. This was the procedural requirement of the Concordance's legal framework, which mandated a response period for any resolution affecting a member species' status. After 6 months, if no response altered the Council's assessment, implementation would proceed. Implementation was not defined in detail in the resolution itself. The implementation protocol was a separate document, classified at the Council's highest level, that my mother did not have access to. She did not need access to it. What she had prepared for years was not a response to the resolution's implementation protocol. It was a response to the resolution's premise. The resolution's premise was that the human species represented a threat. The premise was, in a narrow technical sense, accurate. The trajectory was real. The development rate was real. The capability assessment was real. What the premise missed was the conclusion it drew from those facts, which was that the only way to address a species that was developing faster than the models predicted and in ways the models couldn't fully capture was to eliminate the species. The premise missed the conclusion because the Council had spent 40 years analyzing humanity through its threat assessment framework, which was a framework designed to evaluate threats, and the framework had concluded, accurately, that humanity was a potential threat. The framework was not designed to evaluate humanity as anything else. My mother's preparation had been to build the case for what humanity was as something else. The formal response to the resolution was filed on day 14 of the 6-month window. It was not the response the Council had expected. Most formal responses to Council resolutions were diplomatic documents, arguments for why the resolution should be reconsidered, proposals for alternative approaches, evidence that the concerns the resolution addressed were overstated. Humanity's formal response was 7,000 pages. It was not a diplomatic document. It was a research compilation. The 7,000 pages contained the full documentation of every significant concordance scientific and technological breakthrough in the previous 80 years, with a detailed analysis of the human contribution to each breakthrough. The analysis was comprehensive and precise. It showed, item by item, the specific research contributions that human scientists had made to 31 separate fields over 80 years of integration. It showed which breakthroughs had been collaborative, which had been primarily human, which had built on previous concordance work in ways that human perspective had extended. It showed, in aggregate, that the human species' contribution to concordance scientific development over 80 years had exceeded the combined contribution of all other species in 12 of the 23 categories the Council's own assessment models tracked. It showed, specifically, that the energy physics breakthrough that had triggered the Military Analysis Committee's concern had been developed by a team of 23 researchers, of whom 19 were human and were from 3 other species, and that the non-human team members had contributed specific components of the work that the human members had identified as essential. It showed that the adapted military application that the committee had found alarming had been identified as a potential application not by the research team, which had not been thinking about military applications, but by the committee itself. The response did not argue that the research was not dangerous. It argued something else. It argued that the relevant question was not whether humanity's capabilities were increasing, which they were, but what humanity was doing with those capabilities, which the 7,000 pages documented in detail. It argued that the Council had spent 40 years building a threat assessment of humanity's trajectory and 0 years building an opportunity assessment of humanity's trajectory. It argued that those were different analyses that produced different conclusions. And it made one additional argument which was the one that my mother had been building toward for years. The additional argument was in the response's final section. The final section was 300 pages. It contained a specific kind of documentation that the Council had not previously received in a formal resolution response. A catalogue of the species the Council's threat assessment framework had failed. Not species that the Concordance had wrongly classified as threats. Species that the Concordance's approach to threat assessment had processed as threats and had addressed through measures that the document, with precision and without editorial, described outcome by outcome. The documentation was drawn from the Concordance's own historical records, which were accessible through the Liaison Office's administrative archive access. My mother had been reading those records for 4 years. The documentation showed that the Concordance Council, over its 300-year history, had voted on 9 resolutions addressing species it had assessed as developmental threats. It showed the outcomes of those 9 resolutions. 3 species had been successfully integrated through negotiated development frameworks that had produced mutual benefit. These outcomes were in the Concordance's historical record as successes. 2 species had declined integration negotiations and had left the Concordance's sphere, producing outcomes that the historical record described as unresolved. 4 species had been addressed through the implementation protocol. The 4 species no longer existed. The documentation did not call these outcomes wrong. It called them outcomes. It presented them, factually, with dates and Council vote margins and the specific reasoning the Council had used in each case. Then it asked a question. Question was what was lost not? Was lost The 3 successful integrations were documented in detail in the Concordance's historical record. The contributions those species had made to the Concordance over the centuries following integration were measurable and measured. The 4 species that had been addressed through the implementation protocol were documented in the Council's records through the vote and the implementation confirmation and nothing after. The documentation asked, what would those 4 species have contributed to the Concordance if they had been integrated rather than erased? What scientific developments might they have produced? What perspectives might they have added to Council deliberations? What problems that remain unsolved in the Concordance's research programs might they have helped solve? It noted that the question was unanswerable because the answer required knowledge of what they would have done, and they had not been allowed to do it. It noted that this was a specific kind of loss that the Council's threat assessment framework was not designed to measure. It noted that the Council's framework was excellent at measuring the cost of a threat that was allowed to develop. It was not designed to measure the cost of a potential contribution that was never allowed to exist. It concluded, humanity is, by your own assessment, the most rapidly developing species the Concordance has encountered. This is also an accurate description of the most potentially valuable contributor to the Concordance's future that you have encountered. These are the same fact. Your framework has led you to assess only one of its implications. The Council received the response on day 14. It was distributed to all 31 member species delegations. It was read. The Council chamber convened on day 21 for the first formal discussion of the response. I was not in the observation gallery that day because the formal discussion sessions were closed. But my mother was in them because the Liaison Office's procedural position in formal response discussions was as a presenting party, and she had 7,000 pages of documentation to present. She presented it over for sessions across 2 weeks. I have read the transcripts. The transcripts are available in the Concordance's historical archive, and they are worth reading in full by anyone who wants to understand what the discussion was actually like. I am going to describe only the moment that I believe changed the outcome. It happened in the 3rd session. The Council's lead advocate for the resolution was a Verith legal specialist named Seth Ralvass, who had been in the Council's legal service for 30 years and who had written a significant portion of the resolution's legal language. He was formidable, precise, and entirely convinced that the Council's assessment was correct. He asked my mother, during the third session, a question that he clearly believed was unanswerable. He said, "The response catalog presents for historical implementation cases as evidence of lost potential. But these cases were resolved based on threat assessments that the Council made with the information available at the time. The Council's process was sound." He paused. "Are you arguing that the Council should not have made those decisions?" My mother said, "No." He said, "Then what are you arguing?" She said, "I'm arguing that the Council should make this decision with more information than it had in those 4 cases." She paused. The 4 historical cases were assessed with the threat assessment framework only. She paused. "I'm asking the Council to also complete an opportunity assessment before voting on implementation." She paused. "Not instead of a threat assessment. In addition to one." He said, "An opportunity assessment is not part of the Council's standard resolution protocol." She said, "It isn't." She paused. "I'm asking the Council to do something it hasn't done before." He said, "On what basis?" She said, "On the basis that the 4 historical cases suggest the standard protocol may not be producing optimal outcomes." She paused. "I'm not asking the Council to abandon its threat assessment. I'm asking it to augment it." She paused. 7,000 pages of documentation of human contributions to concordance science over 80 years represent the beginning of an opportunity assessment that the Council has not conducted. She paused. "We respectfully ask that the Council conduct it before making an irreversible decision." He said, "The timeline," she said. "The timeline is 5 months and 2 weeks remaining." She paused. "An opportunity assessment of a species that has been a productive member of the Concordance for 80 years can be completed in that time." She paused. "If the assessment confirms that the threat outweighs the opportunity, the Council's position will be strengthened by the additional analysis." She paused. "If it doesn't, the Council will have information it currently lacks." He was quiet. She said, "Either outcome is better than the current decision, which is made without the assessment." The Council voted on day 38 to conduct the opportunity assessment before proceeding with implementation. The vote was not unanimous. It was 22 to 9. The 9 who voted against were not convinced. They remained concerned, and their concerns were legitimate, and the record should reflect that their concerns were not ignored. But 22 voted for the assessment. The opportunity assessment took for months. I watched my mother work during those for months. Not the specific work, which was conducted by a team of 43 specialists from 12 species who had been assembled specifically for the assessment, but the shape of the work, the quality of attention she brought to it. She was not performing confidence. She had told me, in the weeks before the assessment began, that she did not know how it would conclude. She had made the best case she could. The assessment would find what it found. She was calm in the way I have described. The genuine kind. The assessment was completed on day 164 of the 6-month window. It was 2,000 pages. Its conclusions were formally presented to the full Council in a closed session on day 170. I do not have the transcript of that session. It was not made public for 15 years, at which point the classification period expired. What I know is what my mother told me when she came home that evening. She sat down and she was quiet for a while. Then she saw the assessment found that over 80 years, human scientific contributions to the Concordance have either directly produced or created the conditions for 23 significant breakthroughs that the assessment's modeled counterfactual shows would not have occurred. or would have occurred 40 to 70 years later, without human involvement. She paused. She said, 23 breakthroughs in 80 years. The assessments, extended model shows that over the next century, the expected value of human scientific contribution to the concordance, if integration continues, exceeds the expected cost of the threat scenario by a factor that the assessment describes as significant. She looked at me. She said, "Factor of significant." I said, "Is that good?" She said, "It's what the assessment found." She paused. "The council has to decide what to do with it." I said, "What do you think they'll do?" She said, "I think they'll debate it for a very long time." She paused. "And then I think they'll decide." I said, "Which way?" She said, "I don't know." She paused. "I've made the case. The assessment has made the case." She paused. "The rest is their decision." She was quiet. Then she said, "Mara." I said, "Yes." She said, "Whatever they decide." "We did this right." She paused. The argument was sound. The documentation was complete. The assessment was fair. She paused. "We asked them to look at the full picture. We gave them everything they needed to look at it." She paused. "Whatever they decide with that, we did our part correctly." I said, "What if it's not enough?" She said, "Then we find out." The council vote on day 197 was not unanimous. It was 28-3. The resolution was not implemented. The council issued, in its place, a structured integration agreement that included a development monitoring framework, a joint scientific cooperation protocol, and a formal human seat on the council, the first new council seat added in 40 years. The 3 dissenting votes remained dissenting. Their concerns were not resolved. They were recorded in the council's formal record alongside the outcome because the council's record was honest, and honest records included dissent. My mother received the outcome in the council chamber. I was in the observation gallery. I watched her receive it with the same quality of attention she had brought to everything in the preceding months. She did not cry. She did not celebrate visibly. She sat for a moment with the specific stillness of someone who has been carrying something very heavy and has just been permitted to set it down. Then she looked up at the gallery. She found me. She nodded. That was all. I am 63 years old. The events I have described happened 51 years ago. The world is different in ways that I could not have imagined when I was 12 years old in that observation gallery. The council seat has been occupied by 8 human representatives over the 51 years. The Joint Scientific Cooperation Protocol has produced 41 significant breakthroughs in the first 40 years, which is slightly ahead of the Opportunity Assessment's projected rate. The 3 species that voted against remain members of the Council. The formal diplomatic relationship with humanity has been correct throughout. In 2 cases, human scientific contributions have directly benefited those 3 species in ways that the historical record documents. The relationship is not without tension. It has never been without tension. 31 species, with different histories and interests and definitions of what is right, do not achieve a tension-free relationship. What they can achieve, if they work at it, is a relationship that is honest and functional and that produces more than any of them could produce alone. My mother is 89. She is still, by any fair assessment, one of the sharpest people I have ever met. I asked her once, when I was older and had the context to ask the question properly, what she had thought in the 45 minutes she sat in the gallery after the first vote. She said, "I was thinking about the case." I said, "You were already thinking about the response." She said, "I was reviewing the case I'd been building for years, checking whether it was complete, identifying the weaknesses." I said, "Were there weaknesses?" She said, "Several." She paused. The strongest part was the opportunity assessment argument, And it was strong because it was true. Not just rhetorically true, factually true. The council had not done an opportunity assessment. The historical cases showed that the missing assessment had produced incomplete analysis. She paused. When the argument is true, it's stronger than when it's just well made. I said, "Were you afraid?" She said, "Of course." I said, "What did you do with the fear?" She looked at me in the way she had looked at me my entire life, with complete attention. She said, "Made the case." She paused. She said, "The fear was real. The case was also real. You do the work." I said, "What if they'd voted the other way?" She said, "Then I would have been wrong about what was possible." She paused. "But I wouldn't have been wrong about whether to try. I have thought about this for the 51 years since. I have thought about 31 species voting unanimously to erase us. I have thought about my mother sitting in the gallery for 45 minutes thinking about her case. I have thought about 7,000 pages of documentation. About an opportunity assessment that had never been conducted. About the question what was lost that could not be answered for species that were not here to answer it. I have thought about the fact that the argument worked not because it was clever, but because it was true. And because the truth was that the council had an incomplete picture, and was making an irreversible decision with an incomplete picture. And that making a case for completing the picture was not the same as making a case for a particular outcome. My mother did not argue that humanity was not dangerous. She argued that dangerous and valuable were not mutually exclusive. She argued that an irreversible decision required the full picture. She gave them the full picture. They decided. We had other plans. The plans were make it de casi. Give them the picture. Trust the process, that we believed in enough to stake everything on. It worked, not because we were stronger. Because we were right. And because my mother spent for years making sure the case was complete before she had to make it. Mara, Vasquez's Say Concordance Archives, Year 2 for 8-9.